Good morning, GLA middle schoolers. Today's date is Thursday, June 4th of 2020. I am very happy to be here with you. My name is Mr. Manta, and we're going to keep moving along in our planet, on our unit, on our planet. We got our 7th lesson today. We're talking all about air pollution. We're also going to talk about climate change, global warming, some really big stuff, but we'll explain when we get there. As always, you should have your notebooks with you. Label today is heading Unit 7, Lesson 7, Air Pollution, and number out number 1 through 5 for your Do Now. Here are those 5 Do Now questions, reviewing what we learned in last lesson. Go ahead and pause the video and answer these 5 questions now. Alright, I'm assuming that you've now done that. Here we go, let's look at some answers. Number 1, is there more salt water or fresh water on Earth? Correct answer is salt water, and that is by far, it's not even close. There's like 97% of the water on Earth is salt water in the oceans. Number 2, the number 1 thing we use the most land for in the United States is raising cattle. You could also say cows if you prefer to say that. Number 3, what do scientists call the variety of life that exists around the world? We learned a term for that yesterday. It is biodiversity. Number 4, the number 1 thing that causes animals to be endangered is habitat loss. It's another term we learned yesterday. It simply means that animals are running out of places to live because the habitats or the environments they live in are slowly being turned into farms and cities and roads and things that people use instead. And number 5, true or false, there are more people working to protect wildlife now than ever before. Well, that, folks, is true. Thank goodness, because they also face more problems now than they probably ever have before. All right, to recap what we've talked about so far this unit. If you guys remember all the way back earlier this year, I told you that you could think of the whole Earth as being divided into 4 different spheres. That was like in Unit 2 or 3. We said there's the lithosphere, which is the solid Earth, the hydrosphere, that's all of the water, the atmosphere, which is the gases that surround the Earth, all the air, and the biosphere, which is everything that's alive. And these 4 things together make up the Earth and its systems, right? Well, in this final unit on our planet and all the problems that it's facing, we've been kind of addressing the Earth by going 1 sphere at a time. I haven't said this explicitly, but my basic strategy here has been that we started with the hydrosphere. We had lesson 3 all about our water use. We learned that most of the water on Earth, 97% of it's all ocean water. We learned that there's this thing called virtual water use. That's all the water that has to get used to make the stuff that you buy, eat, and wear, right? Then after that, we went up here to the lithosphere and talked instead about land use in lesson 4. With the lithosphere, we looked at a bunch of maps like this one that showed how much land in the United States we use for different purposes. We learned that we use the most land for grazing cattle and also quite a lot for grazing crops, but we also have a lot of land dedicated to forests, which is really great. And we learned that, man, heck, there's a lot of cows across the United States because we love our cheeseburgers and our steaks. It's causing a bit of a problem for some of the animals on Earth, right? Afterwards, we jumped over then to this side and we talked about the biosphere for our last couple lessons. We had lesson 5 first on life on Earth and lesson 6 all about biodiversity. In our lesson about life on Earth, we learned about this thing called biomass, that you can add up all of the different living things of any given species and see how much biomass they have altogether. We learned that most of the biomass on Earth is plants, and animals are really only a pretty small part of that. In our lesson on biodiversity, we talked about some of those animals that exist, talked about the different animals that are out there, mostly bugs and fish, we learned. And we learned that the number 1 thing threatening all these beautiful animals, like the Siberian tiger, is habitat loss. They're running out of places to live. Habitat loss, big scary term. So we've covered 1, 2, 3 of the 4 spheres, which means that today we're going to focus all on the atmosphere. And then we'll have all 4 spheres covered, and then we can have some pretty fun lessons I'm hoping for next week. So let's talk about the atmosphere. The first thing that I want to ask you guys, because I had asked this question at the start of this unit, I asked you guys about climate change, and I learned that all of my students have really different opinions about climate change. Some of you guys said you don't really know anything about it at all, and that's okay. Some of you guys said you're very worried about it, you think it's a big problem that we're going to face in the future. And some folks said, I'm not that worried about it, I don't think it's a very big concern for me. Well, for class for question 1, I want to get a sense not just of what you know, but of how you know it. So I want you to tell me, where have you heard about climate change before, right? What are like the common things you can remember, or people, or videos, whatever it is that told you about climate change? Have you seen anything about it on the internet or in school? And do your parents ever talk about climate change? Make sure to answer all parts of that question. Pause the video and answer classwork question 1 now. Alright, assuming that you're now unpausing so we can move on. I'm very curious to see what you guys tell me. Since people had such different answers on how they feel about climate change, maybe everyone is hearing about it from different sources. But today we're talking not just about climate change, but air and air pollution in general, right? And when I say pollution, your mind probably pulls up an image that kind of looks like this, of some big dirty factory that's spewing unhealthy, poisonous, harmful kind of stuff into the air. And that's what most people know about pollution. They know that pollution is this dirty stuff that goes into the air, and they know it's bad. And they might say something like this one right here, that that's pollution, and pollution is bad. It's poisoning people, and it poisons the earth. They don't like pollution. And well, hey, that is absolutely true. I don't want to say that this woman is wrong. She's absolutely correct here by saying that this is what pollution often looks like, and it's bad, and it's poisoning the earth and poisoning people. But I also want to do a little bit better. I want to take this one step further and help bring us up to a middle school level understanding of the different kinds of pollution that exist and what it is that we can do about them. Because this is just kind of a, hey, pollution bad, that's a little bit too simple. We want to give it a little bit more advanced than that so we know how we can solve those problems, right? So the first thing that I want to make, so the big question, the way we're going to address this today, is by examining what are the different kinds of air pollution, along with what can we do to stop them. It's a big question. The first big point that I want to make to you guys is that there are count them, two different types of air pollution. We're going to talk about each type separately. We have local air pollution over here, and then we have greenhouse gases over here, which cause climate change. These are similar in some ways, like they both come from factories and power plants making energy and making things, but they're also different in some ways. Like they're each bad for the earth, but in very different ways, right? So let's first start by talking about local air pollution and some of these polluted cities that exist around the world. All right, our type 1 is local air pollution, and our key point about it, write this down, is that local air pollution is when chemicals are released into the air that are bad for our health, and they make people unhealthy. They're even bad for the health of animals and plants, and they can't survive very well when there's too much air pollution. Now, these chemicals that make up the typical local air pollution have all these sciencey sounding names, things like sulfur oxides and particulate matter and lead emissions and ozone and carbon monoxide and the last one, nitrous oxides. These fancy chemical names that maybe you'll learn about somewhere down the line, but we don't need to go into each one of those individually today, because usually they're all kind of mixed together, and together they make up this nasty mixture that's bad for our health, that gets into the air sometimes and creates this local air pollution. Another thing I want to make very clear is where it comes from, right? So local air pollution, it comes from a lot of things, but usually you want to think of it coming from big cities, power plants, factories, farms sometimes, and automobiles like cars and trucks. Planes and trains, yes, they also create air pollution too. So this example is a picture in India. I believe this is in the city of Agra, where the Taj Mahal is. And you can see there's so many cars and there's so much pollution that goes on in the city that you can see very faintly this building in the background, but you can hardly even see it given how polluted the air is. That's because there's a lot of pollution in the air, and people are worse off in terms of their health because they're breathing that in all the time. Too many factories and cars and buildings, right? Another point I want to make very clear. The reason why we call it local air pollution is because it mostly stays in the same region where it was created. This kind of pollution, it doesn't affect the whole Earth all at once. It affects one kind of big area on the Earth. So like here's a picture that was taken from outer space of China on a day, someday, who knows when they were producing a lot of pollution. So you have like big cities like Beijing and Tianjin up here in China, and there's probably a lot of factories that are making pollution. And so you can see there's this kind of gray cloud, this fog or haze that is over this big part of China, and that's really bad for the people there to be breathing in, but it mostly only stays where it was created. So like it's definitely bad that China is creating all of this air pollution, but it doesn't really affect us over here in the United States very much. It eventually gets kind of blown away by the wind, and it mostly spreads out in the atmosphere, and that's a problem, but it's mostly a problem for the people who live right here in these cities, because that kind of pollution mostly stays where it was created. this is an interesting video because since I'm telling you that pollution, it's right, one way that we can see the fact that it comes from all this stuff that we do and it mostly stays in one place is to examine the way that the first coronavirus COVID outbreak, which happened in China, really affected the pollution that they had there. Now, in China, just like in America, when COVID first started being a really big problem, the government told people to stop leaving their homes, stop driving cars, stop going to work. All the factories shut down. And because of that, people were burning less energy and less fuel. And because of that, as you're about to see in this video, there was way less air pollution. So right in this video, and I'm going to turn the volume off so I can explain it.
Based on
In this video, what you're looking at right now is that they're making a map. They're coloring all these colors, red and yellow and blue, that show how much air pollution there is throughout these regions in China. And right now we're looking at the late December into early January. And so there's quite a lot of pollution, right, in this, especially in this main part of China. But as the months go on, we're about to enter into the part of the year where China locked down and they had people stop going to work and stop making things. And suddenly we can see now in the beginnings of February and January, and that's when the lockdown happened in China, there's way less air pollution than there previously had been. And so even though there's the virus going on, which is bad for people's health, at least this was happening, which was good for people's health, but they weren't breathing in so much of that bad air pollution. And you can also tell that this pollution is pretty much staying in this one place, right? It's not spreading and going across the ocean to affect America. It's mostly staying in this one place. I'll play the whole video for you one more time. So we have all this pollution because China's doing their usual manufacturing and work back in December and January, and suddenly it starts to fade and it goes almost totally away. Oh, and then, by the way, now that China's coming back out of a lockdown, it's starting to come back again. And we're seeing more pollution once again, which is interesting, right? So that's local air pollution. That's that first type that we talked about. And it's really bad for people who live in cities where that's going on a lot, but it doesn't affect the rest of the world so much. It's just bad for our health, pretty much, right? There's a second and very different type of pollution, which is called greenhouse gases. Maybe you've heard that term before, maybe you haven't. But the reason why I have the picture of the Earth here is because when we produce greenhouse gases, those affect the entire Earth altogether by causing climate change and global warming. Type 2, and you should probably write this down even though it doesn't say key point, greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases aren't bad for you to breathe, like local pollution was. Instead, they're bad because they cause climate change and global warming. So what that means is that today, you can be breathing easy no matter how much greenhouse gases we're producing. You can breathe them in all day long, not going to affect your health. But 10, 20, 50 years down the road, they are already, and they'll continue to be causing these various problems that we associate with climate change and global warming. So they're not necessarily a problem, like they're not bad for you to breathe in right off the bat. They're bad because they mess with the climate and they cause all these catastrophes that we'll see in just a second, right? It's a very different problem. The point that I want you guys to especially retain from this is to understand how it is that greenhouse gases cause climate change. So focus on this for just a second. It's a little bit complicated. The first thing we should understand if we want to understand greenhouse gases is a regular greenhouse. Not greenhouse gases, just a greenhouse, right? A greenhouse is a building where people grow plants. Maybe they grow flowers or crops. Some people have them in their backyards if they really enjoy gardening. Sometimes you'll see them like at the Jewel-Osco parking lot. I know I saw them a lot growing up where they would sell plants and flowers from. And it's a big building that's made out of glass, so it's totally clear. The reason that it's made out of glass is so that the sunshine can shine on through the glass and it can light up all the plants so that they can do their photosynthesis and grow healthy and nice. But then when the heat and the warmth from the sun tries to bounce back out of the greenhouse, it gets trapped by the glass. So a greenhouse, even in winter, can stay surprisingly warm because it has lots of heat coming in, but when it tries to bounce back out, instead it gets trapped and it stays inside. So these glass greenhouses stay really warm, and that's a good place for plants to grow in, right? Because they have sunlight, they have warmth, and they have all the carbon dioxide they need, and people water them, right? And they stay really warm because they're trapping heat inside of them. Well, that same idea that you let sunlight in but then you don't let it out to make things warm is in fact how greenhouse gases work too. We call it the greenhouse effect, and that's how it works in our atmosphere. So you have the Earth down here, right? You have the sun that's shining on the Earth, and you have the atmosphere, which is the layer of gases that surround the Earth, right? Now, the greenhouse effect is what happens when the sunshine, just like in a greenhouse, shines down and warms up the surface of the Earth. But then when that same warmth, that thermal energy, it's actually infrared radiation, which we learned about at one point, tries to bounce back out and escape from the Earth, it gets trapped by this layer of greenhouse gases that exist in the atmosphere. Some of it can make it out, but most of it gets trapped inside instead. Now, it's good to have a little bit of greenhouse gases in the Earth, and we've always had greenhouse gases, but since we're creating more and more and more of them, this layer that blocks gas from escaping is getting thicker and thicker and thicker. And that means that more and more heat and energy are getting trapped inside the atmosphere with us. And that's making things go a little bit crazy. Specifically, it's causing global warming. Now, the number one greenhouse gas that we have to know about, which causes this, is carbon dioxide. And one of the ways that scientists know that that's such a big part of the problem is that if you look at graphs of carbon dioxide and temperature, you can see them match. So over here, this is a graph that some scientists made over time, right? So this is all the way back in the 1700s, and we have 2020 over here. It's a graph over time of how much carbon dioxide, CO2, is in the atmosphere. So you can see that a long time ago there was very little CO2, and slowly we've been adding more and more and more and more, and now it's shooting up at a really fast rate, which is pretty scary, right? So the curve generally goes like this. Well, over here, if you look at a graph of global average temperatures, you see pretty much the same pattern. That if you go back in time to the 1800s, they were pretty normal for a while, and now as we've added more and more carbon dioxide, they've gone up and up and up. Now that's the global average temperature, right? So that doesn't say that every single day is going to be hot. Some days will be hot, some days will be warm. But overall, global temperatures on Earth are getting hotter and hotter than ever before every year because we're adding more and more CO2, right? You can see these two graphs match. They both make the same shape because that CO2 is causing the temperatures to increase on Earth. That's why we call it global warming. Now, some people, when they hear that, they think that doesn't sound like such a big problem. They're like, man, global warming sounds great. It's too cold most of the year anyway, man. If global warms up, I'll be at the beach every day. I'll be hanging out, relaxing. But they don't quite understand what people mean when they say global warming and climate change. Global warming and climate change, and I use those two terms mostly interchangeably. They basically refer to the same idea. There's a slight difference between them, but they both mostly mean the same thing. Global warming, climate change, would cause things like sea level rise. So this is one of the feared consequences that could happen maybe 100 years from now, is that the oceans literally get higher. There's more and more water, and as a result of that, cities like this is a computer generated picture of New York City. Some of these cities could get flooded. Darn it, phone, go away. Some of these cities could get flooded with water if the sea levels keep on rising and rising, and they'd get destroyed. That'd be bad. They'd cause drought. That's no good either. We have people like these farmers wouldn't be able to grow food, and then there wouldn't be food for us to eat because things would be too hot and too dry for the plants to grow. They cause more hurricanes. And if you've ever traveled along the coast, especially in the south, you know that hurricanes like Katrina and Hurricane Harvey are a huge problem. They destroy people's homes. They can be really dangerous. And with more climate change, they're expected to get worse, and they're going to be more frequent. And, ooh, by the way, yeah, they also can cause wildfires. This is a picture from Los Angeles from a few years ago in 2017. I think there were really bad wildfires in Los Angeles, and some of these hillsides along the city got caught on fire. Well, if things get hotter because of global warming and you have these long droughts where there's no rain, these wildfires can get a lot worse. So now this guy over here is not looking so relaxed anymore. He's probably pretty spooked about this stuff. Now, once you learn that global warming causes all this terrible stuff, most people say, okay, I don't want climate change to happen anymore. How can we stop it, right? How can we prevent all that stuff from happening? That sounds really bad. Well, first thing we should remember is it's not just global warming, right? It's both types of pollution that are bad. We don't want local air pollution because it's bad for us to breathe. We don't want greenhouse gases because they cause climate change. They're both bad. Luckily, you can help reduce them both at the same time. In general, the things that will make local air pollution go down are the same things that will make greenhouse gases also go down. So that's the good news, right? And The first thing we should understand is that the government has a big job here. And some people will say this should totally be the government's job, and people argue and disagree about a lot of this stuff. But the government definitely has part of the job because they can reduce local pollution and greenhouse gases by changing how we get our energy. So all the energy that you and I use to, like the gasoline that goes in our cars and the electricity that we get when we plug something into the wall, right? All of that stuff is ultimately what's mostly, it's the main factor that causes global warming and local pollution, right? So what we need is less of some things and more of something. Specifically over here, we need less of these big power plants that burn fossil fuels. Fuels like coal is what we're looking at right here, and natural gas, right? Those burning those things to generate, and we do that to generate electricity, but burning those things also adds to local pollution and it adds to greenhouse gases. The same is true every time that you put gasoline in your car, then you drive your car around burning off that gasoline. It's not the best thing to do for the environment because it causes pollution and it causes global warming. That's no good. Instead, what we need more of are cleaner ways to generate electricity. So, for example, every year we're building more and more wind turbines and wind farms in the United States. And these are built instead to harvest energy from the power of wind itself. You also see more and more every year in the United States more solar panels and solar farms, which are able to produce electricity just from having sunlight shine on them. And they don't need to burn anything, they don't need anything like that. They just sit out there and they make electricity, which is awesome. And every year we're getting a little bit more of this stuff and a little bit less of this stuff, but we need to do that even faster and faster. We really should not be building any new fossil fuel plants in 2020. But in addition to the government, we can't just, ask them to fix everything. You and I can also help reduce local pollution and greenhouse gases just by finding ways to use less energy and fuel in our lives. So the same is true for us, right? There are some things that we should do less of and things we should do more of. Some of the things we should do less of are things like driving our cars everywhere all the time. If you need to get somewhere instead, what we can do more of is using public transit, because it takes a lot of energy to power a train, but there can be like 100 people on a train at once, right? Instead of 100 separate cars. And riding your bike to get around. Walking, riding a bike, anything you can do. Even carpooling with other friends so it's only one car instead of 2 or 3 is great. We need less of people leaving their lights on and otherwise wasting energy and electricity around the house when they don't need to, and more of people being considerate and only using lights that they need. So you only need the lights on in the room that you're in at any given time, not all the rest of the house. And we need a heck of a lot less of people buying and using a million different electronics and gadgets all the time, because making them and using them takes energy and electricity. And instead, when you are going to buy an appliance, and especially the ones that use a lot of energy, like refrigerators and washing machines and TVs, you can look for one that is certified by this company called Energy Star. Energy Star, all they do is they go around and they find different products that are really efficient, that only use a tiny, tiny bit of electricity to get the job done. And when you are old enough to start buying your own appliances, you want to make sure that you're buying ones that are energy efficient, not inefficient, right? The last thing that we could also all do is, because we keep on bringing it up, eat less of this kind of stuff, less food that has beef and meat in it, because we've been learning about how much land and water it takes to make beef. It also takes a heck of a lot of energy to raise these cattle, to transport them around. And we could stand to all eat a lot more vegetables, right? And things that aren't meat products. That doesn't just mean vegetables, it also means anything that isn't meat. So heck, even pizza, that's a lot better for the environment than burgers are. And it's not right, you don't have to eat 100% this kind of way, but it stands to do a little bit better. I also want to let you guys in on a secret, which is when I was a kid, I ate junk food like basically all the time. And as much as my mom and dad tried to fight with me and say, hey, eat your healthy food, I just didn't like the taste of it at all. And I swear to God, some strange thing happens once you start going into high school and college, and healthy food just starts tasting better. I swear. I thought all this stuff tasted so bad when I was little, and now I mostly eat food like this. And yeah, sometimes I'll treat myself to something like this as well. You might be a little suspicious at this point, because I keep on bringing up this thing about cheeseburgers and cows and how bad they are for the environment. You might be asking, Mr. Manta, are you trying to turn me into a vegetarian, right? Someone who only eats vegetables, who doesn't eat any meat. Now, I know a lot of vegetarians. I respect tremendously people who are vegetarians. I have a really hard time only eating vegetarian. So I'm telling you, no, I am not trying to turn you into a vegetarian. Unless, Aaliyah Davis, you already are one, in which case you should be very proud. But here's the thing. Simplest way I can put it, the Earth would really appreciate if we could all try to eat meat a little less often. A lot of people like to do, for example, meatless Mondays. They say, on every Monday, I'm only going to eat vegetarian. That's great. That's an awesome step in the right direction, and it makes the Earth very happy. All right, for our second classwork question, I want you guys to think for a second about all the different things that we've talked about that you can do for the Earth to solve all these different problems. What really, really is one of them that you would be willing to do to help save our planet? Tell me in classwork question 2. Pause the video and answer this question now. All right, assume that you have now done that. I'm going to move on from this question and wrap it up with independent practice. Number those notebooks 1 through 8, folks. Here are your 8 independent practice questions. Pause the video and answer them now. All right, I'm assuming that you've done that. Let's see some answers. Number 1, the number one thing causing animals to be endangered is habitat loss. That was from yesterday, not from today. Habitat loss. Number 2, some people think that all pollution is the same, but really there are 2 different types of pollution. We talked about those. Number 3, local air pollution, that's that first type, is when chemicals are released into the air that are bad for our health. Number 4, true or false? This kind of pollution mostly stays in the same region when it's created. That is true. So when the Chinese are making lots of air pollution, that's mostly bad for Chinese people. When Americans make lots of air pollution, that's mostly bad for Americans. Number 5, true or false? Greenhouse gases are bad for you to breathe. Well, that's pretty much false. Greenhouse gases aren't a problem because they're bad for you to breathe. Instead, number 6, greenhouse gases are bad because they cause climate change. That part is true. That's why we don't like them. And number 7, the number 1 greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, a gas we've talked about a lot this year because it's so important for so many different topics. Lastly, we had number 8, true or false? Taking public transit instead of driving a car helps slow down climate change. That is true. And so if you are taking public transit these days, or heck, once the public transit gets going again and coronavirus calms down, when you take public transit, you should feel good for yourself. It's better for the environment than driving in a car. As always, star those questions you got right, fix the ones you got wrong, and tell me in the classwork form. And that is all we got for today. It is exit ticket time. Enjoy yourselves. Knock out your exit ticket. And I want to link today's cool thing. It is a particularly impressive one today, I have to say. There's this young musician who goes by the name Jacob Collier, this guy right here, who I have recently become a huge fan of. He's just incredibly talented and makes really interesting music. He's an amazing singer. The video that I'm going to link you guys is him doing a little tiny concert inside of this office, but it's just incredible. He has these backup singers with him, and for all my girls in Tennessee and Georgia Tech who like to sing, man, y'all gotta watch these guys sing because it is incredible what they can do with their voices. All right, that's all we got for today. Good chatting with all of you guys, and I will talk to you again on Monday. See you then.